There is a chapter missing from the story of East Asia's growth, not because it failed but because it worked too well. And without it, the economic miracle never happens. They got rich because their governments legally destroyed their own landed elites. Before the export miracles, before Samson, before semiconductors, there was a quiet revolution happening in the countryside, and without it, nothing that followed would have worked. Before the 1950s, both Korea and Taiwan had the same structural disease. You had vast estates owned by a tiny landlord class, while millions of tenant farmers paid 50 to 70% of their harvest just in rent. There was absolutely no incentive for them to improve the land, leading to chronic rural poverty and the constant risk of rebellion. This wasn't just unfair, it was economically paralyzing. A country like this cannot industrialize, not sustainably, not peacefully. Think about it. Hungry peasants don't become productive factory workers. Extreme inequality kills domestic demand because no one has money to buy things, and the elites block any meaningful reform to protect their rental income. This is the exact point where most post-colonial states stalled out. Now, here's the part of the story that's almost never taught. In 1949, South Korea's government passed a land reform law. It capped land ownership at 3 hectares and forced landlords to sell their excess land. This land was then sold directly to the tenant farmers who worked it. And how were the landlords paid? With government bonds, which inflation later made almost worthless. This was not voluntary. This was not gradual. This was enforced. In Taiwan, they went even further with their land to the tiller program from 1949 to 1953. First, their laws limited rent to a maximum of 37.5% of the harvest. Then, they transferred land ownership directly to the people who actually worked it. But here's the genius move. They compensated the old landlords with shares in state-owned industries. So the elites didn't just disappear, they were pushed out of rent-seeking and into manufacturing. This is crucial. These laws triggered 3 irreversible transformations. First, political stability. Farmers who owned their own land stopped rebelling, the countryside stopped burning, and the state gained legitimacy. Second, a surge in domestic demand. Millions of new small landowners could now spend, save, and educate their children. This created a massive internal market for the industries that were about to be built. And third, a release of human capital. Once agriculture stabilized and became more productive, excess labor could move to the cities and work in factories without causing famines or social chaos. This is why their industrialization didn't collapse under its own weight. So here's the uncomfortable conclusion. The part development textbooks tend to skip. These reforms were coercive. They hurt powerful elites. They were politically dangerous, and they required an extremely strong state to pull off. But they worked because they attacked the real bottleneck to development: land-based inequality and rent extraction. The factories came later, the exports came later, the free markets came later. Equality came first by law, not by charity. So the next time someone asks why East Asia industrialized and other regions didn't, don't start with trade policy. Start with a different question: who owned the land, and who had the power to take it back? Because before South Korea and Taiwan built world-class industries, they dismantled feudalism. Legally, deliberately, and at enormous political risk. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more stories you won't find in textbooks.